Thank you for watching KTN News and welcome back to Plus. We have discussions to do with the climate and how best we can protect it and take care of it. In studio with me to have this discussion is Brian Omenyi from SIF Kenya and Sandra Siwa from Mama Doing Good. I'll come to you, Brian. Now, the King has just touched on issues to do with climate change and how Kenya is setting the pace when it comes to us planting our trees, the Africa Climate Summit. Remember that Nairobi Declaration from Africa Climate Summit will be used by Africa as a unified voice as we go to COP28 in Dubai. Just how important is it for the King to touch on such issues?
Thank you so much. As you mentioned, the King has applauded Kenya for leading in renewable energy investments. And this is true because when you look at our energy mix, it's about 90% renewable. So comparing this to other countries, we are doing significantly well. Because if you look at a country like South Africa, they're doing about 76 coal, so which is a fossil fuel that we are all looking at transitioning from. So therefore, Kenya stands out because it then sets the pace and sets the best sort of practice that other countries can be able to look at and emulate and be able to do this. So as a country, we have been able to take advantage of the renewable energy resources, looking at geothermal being the leading in Africa generation, contributing about 46% of the energy mix, looking at hydro, which contributes about 36%, solar and wind. And therefore, as a country, this makes us really a key economy for other countries to look at and learn how we have been able to achieve this so that they can be able to replicate the same in their countries.
Sandra, and the King has also touched on the role of the youth in this fight. Just how you as a young person, as the youth, as the people who we will be in this world longer, how important is it for us to jump on this conversation as we talk about issues to do with renewable energy from the youth's perspective?
Thank you so much for that. It is important to know that, as the King has mentioned, the youth, the young people represent a huge untapped potential in the just energy transition, and therefore investing in the youth, because remember that youth not only take part in conversations, but they're the real implementers of change. That means in investing us, the young people, we are the pioneers of innovations, of projects, of technologies that can help in the energy transition. So him touching on the youth is a very critical matter.
And as the youth now, we're proceeding to COP28 and issues around just energy transition, making sure that we we don't get to past 1.5 degrees. How important is this conversation and what is the role of the youth at COP28?
I believe for the youth who will take part, who will get the chance to attend the COP28, I believe that they're the ones who are to drive the force, they're the ones who are supposed to, drive the conversations, because for us to achieve 1.5 degrees Celsius target, it means that we really have to push the agenda, but at the same time, investing back home is key. What matters the most is what are we doing, what are we doing hands-on in order to make sure we are cutting off the emissions, in terms of involvement, in terms of tree planting, in terms of coming up with projects that aim to reduce the emissions. So I think as we proceed to COP28, driving the conversations, but at the same time, investing back home and doing something tangible is key.
Now, Brian, as we talk about just energy transition, renewable energy, the King has touched on the fact that 90% of our energy in the country is renewable, is renewable energy. And we are a country that serves as an example to the rest of the world. But let's go a little bit further. How do we make sure that even as we get into this renewable energy discourse, that it is much cheaper for us to be able to invest into solar and storage of the same wind energy, to be able to get these parts from the producers who are majorly the West? So as we have this discussion on renewable energy in terms of policy conversation, asking for investments in Africa, how should we approach it?
Thank you so much. So we are in the early stages of the transition, and as you can tell, every transition takes time. So it requires persistency and being consistent. And it's important for us to understand where we are as a country. So when we're talking about transition, every country considers its context. So during the Nairobi Declaration, one of the interesting things that came out is Africa has 40% of the global renewable energy resources, but only gets merely 2% of the investments. So in the past decade, about $10 trillion came into the African, was invested in renewable energy, but about $60 billion only got into Africa. So that shows that there is a lot of, not much goodwill from the international community to really invest in us. But then as a continent and as Kenya, we need to ask ourselves, what role do we play? How are our policies to, the policy environment to create an enabling environment for investors to come in and be able to invest their resources, because this is a business, for instance. They need return on investments. So how do we ensure that when they come and invest in our country in the different technologies, they're able to to gain and make profits, and at the same time support us in the transition? The second thing is, as you've mentioned, we will heavily depend on technology from developed countries. So when we have the COP climate change discussions, one of the issues we always, even in the agenda item, is on technology transfer. We acknowledge that as Africa, we have not gotten to that level we are able to sustain ourselves in terms of technology. One, I blame ourselves because we have expertise. We have, we produce some of the best minds. We have some of the best minds in Africa, but they go to other developed countries to work there because, for instance, the income is good on the other side. So how do we ensure that we nurture the skills and be able to retain them in our countries so that we can be able to help us to come up with innovations and technologies that can be able to help us to transition to the renewable energy fully? How do we invest as a country, not only depending on what the international community is giving us, but as a country, what allocations do we give? And one of the important processes going on in the country right now is counties are developing what you call county energy plans. So the county energy plans are taking stock of the potentials within the counties, and each county is mapping out the different resources, looking at the gaps that are existing and building investment cases that can then be able to attract investors to come and bridge the gap. So I believe if every county is at a level where they're developing the county energy plans, then it's going to help us to significantly be able to make energy accessible, affordable, and reliable.
Now, Sandra,
Yes.
you are an engineer. Let's talk about the presence of technology when it comes to having discussions in handling climate change, because it is very integral. When you talk about wind energy, it is technology that is being deployed. We talk about vehicles going electric, that is technology that is being employed. As a young person from Africa, an engineer, then how important is it for governments to invest in our young people so that we can have locally produced solutions to our local problems, so that we invest in our youth who will then help us tap into these renewable energy sources that we have?
So I think, first of all, as an engineer, because the problem that exists in the energy mix, if I may call it, is the problem that Brian has mentioned. We have a lot of people who are good at it. We have experts, but in turn they go and work overseas. Brain drain, 100% at its best. So it means if we try to bridge the gap between the industry key players, different stakeholders, and those who've gone ahead, they can, let's say, career shadowing and providing industry linkages between the students in tertiary university levels and those levels. That way we can be able to bridge the gap, because we shall have the tech, the know-how, hands-on. So by the time we transition, by the time we become graduate engineers, we already know we have the necessary skills needed to pioneer good innovations outside.
And on that, let me just ask you, as an engineer, there's practicals that you always have to do while you're in campus, right?
Yeah.
And as you get out, what sort of support do you get from the government or relevant parties, if any?
To be very honest, that is a very key and critical question. From my perspective, I study energy engineering at Kenyatta University, but I am confident to say that those who've gone ahead of me and even graduated, unfortunately, little or no support has been given to them because, one, we as a country, or rather as Africa, we don't embrace energy engineering as our engineering course because we have a lot of issues in accreditation. We don't have, people who come and career shadow us and tell us this is what to expect in the market. So I think if we really want to bridge the gap in the transition, then these are the key things that should be done. Yes.
Brad, let me just read some stats here real quick. Now, as we talk about renewable energy supply, in 2022, geothermal and ocean power rose to 8%, meaning that shares of the technologies increased by close to 5%. But let's go back to issues to do with carbon emissions. Now, in the 1900s, since 1970, CO2 has increased by over 90%. So clearly, the technology, when it comes to issues to do with clean energy, has risen by around 4%. But we have destroyed the world by upwards of 90%.
Yeah.
She says investment in the engineering sector, people who can be able to change the tide, are not being invested upon. As we go to COP28, what should be our conversation with regard to bringing investments in Africa? Let us not be the guys to clean the environment through carbon credits, but guys who equally play an important role in this conversation.
Thank you so much. Actually, even starting from the point of carbon markets, there was an argument we are having that it's encouraging actually developed countries to emit more while they try to sanitize the whole thing by giving us resources. Because looking at Africa, our urgent need is adaptation. But out of the amount of money that comes into Africa, only 30% comes to adaptation and 70% goes to mitigation. So when you look at that, it shows that it's favoring the developed countries because their urgent need is mitigation to compensate for the targets and the threshold they surpass. So therefore, as we go to COP, as Africa, we need to be very candid. We need to go there with a strong mind. One, there's been a lot of financial commitment that has been made. For instance, the $100 billion, which is yet to come. So how do we push for serious commitments for developed countries to honor this? Look at loss and damage. Last year, we only managed to achieve, the creation of the facility. But if, as Africa, we are not united, because we suffer the most of these effects, if you don't push for it at this COP28, we are going to have these discussions for 8 more years, 5 more years until we get the funds, and we are not even guaranteed they're going to come. So we need to be very critical, push for technology transfer, push for resources, not in debts. Let's get grants, let's let money that is going to come and support us to transition, and not money we are going to be requested and asked to pay back in the future.
And yes, indeed, Brian Omenyi and Sandra, we agree that this conversation definitely must continue. In studio with me has been Brian Omenyi from SIF Kenya and Sandra Siwa, Mama Doing Good, an engineer and a policy expert on issues to do with energy transition and what we must do. And the governments out there, Sandra, saying they need to invest in the young people. Brain drain is a reality in Africa, and the only way we can do that is by investing in the young people who will live in this world longer, because this conversation must continue and we should not wait for funding to come, that we must do what we have to together. My name is Dennis Aseto. This has been Planet Action, and this conversation, I will bring them back again. Today, the King came in, talked about this issue, but time will come. We will continue. My name is Dennis Aseto. Good evening.